All right, everybody, welcome back to Comms 301. Today we're going to start a new unit. Up to this time, we've been talking about ancient technologies, the printing press, things like that. But today we're going to move a little bit forward into, we're prepping for electricity now. Okay, so we're going to talk about electricity and how we got there. And we're going to start here by looking at Lewis Mumford's essay, Cultural Preparation. Okay, so that reading, hopefully you've done it, but that reading isn't just about the machines in the narrow sense of engines, gears, factories, things like that. For Mumford, the machine means an entire social system, a network of tools, of habits, of values, and forms of organization that express a particular way of life. It's both a physical and a moral idea. When Mumford talks about the machine, he's describing a cultural organism, a way of thinking that prizes precision, repetition, control. Or in other words, the machine is as much inside of us as it is around us. That's the key to this lecture and about this reading. And the question here is before we built the modern machine, what had to change inside the human culture for us to be ready for it? So the Industrial Revolution wasn't just made of iron and steam, it was made of habits, of values, of worldviews that had already become mechanical. Okay, so big idea number one, technology emerges from culture. So Mumford begins with a challenge. If we want to understand the machine, we can't just start with engines and gears. We have to start with the human spirit. He writes that the machine was not a sudden creation, but a profound product of centuries of preparation. Before the factory, there was also a mechanical mindset. People had to learn to value precision, regularity, and control before they could actually introduce it into their culture. Okay, so when you think of medieval clock towers, long before factories filled the landscapes, clocks were something that were around, and they were teaching people to think in uniform units, hours, minutes, and seconds. Time became something measurable, tradable, and external. As Mumford puts it, the clock, not the steam engine, is the key machine of the modern age. Once time itself was mechanical or mechanized, the rest followed. This tells us something profound. Technologies are always physical expressions of cultural values. When a society values order, predictability, and progress, its inventions will reflect that same sort of spirit. The inventions will reflect order, predictability, and progress. So for example, in monasteries, bells rang to mark prayer hours. That discipline of timekeeping was spiritual, but it trained Europe to live by the clock. When industrial factories later demanded punctuality, everyone had to get there at the same time to start their shifts. That habit was already ingrained. So the factory wasn't just an economic innovation, it was a cultural inheritance from religious and moral systems that had value structures and obedience. Okay, big idea number two, the rise of mechanical philosophy. By the 17th century, philosopher René Descartes and Francis Bacon, the famous scientist, reframed the world as a giant mechanism. Nature no longer was a living organism, but it was a clockwork system, waiting to be measured and mastered. Mumford calls this the myth of mechanism, the belief that if we can analyze and control every part, we can perfect the whole of the thing. So this shift was revolutionary. Instead of seeking harmony with nature, humans began to see themselves as engineers. Example of this is when René Descartes was dissecting animals to try to figure out how everything worked. He described them as automata, A-U-T-O-M-A-T-A, or self-moving machines without souls. That same logic would later be applied to people in factories whose movements were timed, standardized, and optimized. We can go into scientific management, and maybe in class I'll have a learning activity about that, but that's fascinating how that happened. Okay, we've talked about Harold Innis, but he would say that this marks a bias towards space. a civilization organized around expansion of efficiency and external control. Mumford, though, warns that something spiritual was lost in the process. The organic view of the world, the sense of awe, interdependence, and even moral rhythm was replaced by calculation. All right, so big idea number 3, the machine is a moral symbol. For Mumford, the machine was never just a tool, it was a moral ideal. In early industrial thought, machines represented purity, precision, and self-control, the virtues of the new order. The good worker was efficient, the good society was well regulated. He writes that, quote, the machine itself created a new image of perfection, close quote. To be modern meant to imitate the machine, smooth, predictable, and productive. Even education began to reflect this same sort of mindset. Students drilled like components on an assembly line. And you probably felt that same sort of way when you have taken a test or going to the testing center. You're just cycled through. There's no humanity involved in that. But that's where that comes from. This moralization of technology still lingers. When we say something runs like clockwork, or that a student is being a well-oiled machine, we echo Mumford's insight that mechanical order became a measure of virtue. Efficiency was elevated to an ethical goal. Now I want you to compare this to how we talk about algorithms or AI today. We praise systems that are frictionless or optimized or seamless. It's the same moral vocabulary that we used for the Industrial Revolution. Only the machines themselves have changed. Okay, big idea number 4. Mumford doesn't treat the machine as evil. He respects its genius, but he insists that the mechanical age grew out of a deeper spiritual soil, one that mixed Christian discipleship and discipline with rational science. Medieval monasteries valued labor as devotion. The Benedictine monks had a motto, see if I can say it, it's in Latin, oro et labora, which means pray and work. This made routine holy. The discipline of orderly labor eventually evolved into industrial productivity. So ironically, the machine's ancestors were monks, not merchants. They trained the human will to align with the rhythm of bells, prayers, and tasks. Mumford saw this as a paradox, the spiritual roots of modern technology. So think about how some of the early scientists like Isaac Newton described their discoveries. They talked about it like reading a book of nature. And this was a phrase borrowed from theology. They believed that they were uncovering God's design, using mechanical principles to glorify divine order. Over time, the sacred frame faded. That was the foundation of it, but it kind of faded into the backdrop. But the mechanical habits remained. That's what Mumford means by cultural preparation. The soul of society had already been calibrated to be a machine before the metal ever turned into it. Okay. All right, big idea number 5, the human cost of mechanization. Once the mechanical worldview took hold, it didn't stop with clocks or engines. It extended into social life. Factories reorganized families, cities, and rhythms of rest and worship. Humans began to adapt themselves to the needs of machines, not the other way around. Mumford calls this, quote, the conversion of life to mechanism, close quote. People began to measure success by productivity, not meaning. The body became an instrument, time became currency. So during the early industrial era, factory whistles replaced church bells. The call to prayer became the call to work. Sundays were once reserved for sacred rest, became the only respite or the only, what's the right word? Recess, maybe, from modern production. So in modern terms, think of the smartphone notification tone. It's the new bell of tower calling us to not to pray, but to pay attention. This is why Mumford insists that we must study not only the machines, but the human habits that they encourage. Okay, big idea number 6, rehumanizing the machine. So Mumford doesn't end in despair. He calls for rebalancing. He distinguishes between 2 tendencies. One, the polytechnical tendency, where technologies that integrate with human needs and create in creativity. and monotechnics. These are technologies that dominate and dehumanize. So electric power, he thought, had the potential to liberate society from the rigid rhythms of the clock. Unlike steam, electricity was flexible. It could adapt to human use rather than dictate it. Whether that happens, however, depends on the cultural values, not the mechanical parts. He reminds us that the ultimate machine is man, or humanity, meaning that all technologies must serve the human spirit, not enslave it. I don't know how well we've done. Mumford, the first book he wrote in the early 1930s, and then the last book he wrote was, I think, 1972, and he calls this The Myth of the Machine. And he talks about how we had all of this potentiality that we didn't realize, and he kind of squandered a great opportunity. Anyway, he's a little down in the 70s. A lot of people were, but yeah. Okay, in summary, let's pull everything together. One, the Industrial Revolution became possible because the culture prepared for it. Two, the religious discipline, rational science, and social order created mindsets of precision and control. Three, the mechanical worldview turned efficiency into a moral value. And then over time, that mindset changed not only the work, but perception itself. I think I put four. Mumford believes that we can recover balance by redesigning the tools that serve life, not the other way around. So if you haven't read the article yet, or maybe if you had, I want you to remember this. Mumford is describing psychological and spiritual history of technology, not just a technical one. So to study media history is to study how people learn to think mechanically and how we might think otherwise. All right, so that's the lecture for today. I want you to go take the knowledge check. I don't know what I'll call this, but I think I'll call this Mumford and the Machine, or something like that. And then we'll see you in class. Thank you.